The coffee shop smelled like cinnamon and regret the morning Daniel finally learned. The truth across from him sat the woman he'd fallen impossibly in love with. Over 3 months of sunrise meetings and whispered dreams, her hands trembling. Around a cup she couldn't bring herself to drink. Her name wasn't Emma. She wasn't a freelance photographer traveling the world. She wasn't even passing through his small coastal town by chance. Everything she'd told him was a carefully constructed fiction. And as she sat there with tears streaming down her face, Daniel felt his entire world tilt sideways. The woman he loved was a stranger, and somehow, impossibly, that didn't change the way his heart reached for hers across the scarred wooden table. If you believe in the power of second chances, in the messy beauty of forgiveness and the courage it takes to love despite fear, please like this video, leave a comment below, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring more stories of redemption and real human connection. Her real name was Sarah Mitchell, and she was running not from the law or from danger in any conventional sense, but from a life that had shattered so completely 6 months ago that she could barely recognize the person she'd been before. She'd been a corporate attorney in Boston, engaged to a man her family adored, living in a penthouse apartment with floor-to-ceiling windows that made her feel like she was floating above the messiness of real life. Then came the diagnosis: stage 3 breast cancer, aggressive and hungry. Her fiancé had left within 2 weeks. Unable to handle the reality of illness and possible death, her law firm had been understanding at first, then quietly began reassigning her cases. Her family had smothered her with suffocating worry that felt more like they were mourning her while she was still alive. So Sarah had disappeared after her final chemotherapy treatment, after the doctors declared her in remission but warned her that the next 5 years would be critical. She'd packed a single bag and driven south with no destination in mind. She'd stopped in this weathered fishing town because her car had overheated, and she'd stayed because for the first time in months she could breathe. She'd created Emma because Sarah felt too heavy, too damaged, too much like a ghost of someone who'd already died once Daniel had noticed her that first morning at the coffee shop because she'd been drawing in a sketchbook, her hand moving with uncertain strokes that suggested someone learning to see the world differently. He was a high school English teacher with salt-weathered hands from weekend fishing trips and a smile that made people want to tell him their secrets. He'd asked about her drawings with genuine interest, and she'd lied without hesitation. The lies had tumbled out easily at first. The photography career she'd always dreamed of but never pursued. The adventures she'd only read about in books during chemotherapy sessions. The carefree existence she wished was real. But then something unexpected happened. Daniel kept showing up at the coffee shop. He kept asking questions, not because he was skeptical, but because he was genuinely interested in her fabricated life. He shared his own stories about his divorce 3 years ago, about losing his mother to Alzheimer's, about his teenage students who sometimes broke his heart with their struggles and their resilience. He was so earnestly himself that Sarah found it increasingly difficult to maintain the fiction of Emma. They began meeting deliberately, rather than by accident. He took her hiking on coastal trails where the Pacific crashed against ancient rocks and made everything else seem temporary and survivable. She helped him grade papers at his small house, the one his grandfather had built by hand, and found herself genuinely invested in the grammatical progress of students she'd never meet. They talked about books and heartbreak, about dreams deferred and second acts, about whether it's possible to start over completely, or if we always carry our past selves like shadows. Daniel fell in love with Emma, but really he fell in love with the moments when Sarah forgot to pretend, when she laughed too loudly at his terrible jokes, when she cried during a nature documentary about whale migration, when she unconsciously touched the spot behind her left ear where a small scar marked where her port had been. He fell in love with her gentleness, with his grief, and the way she looked at the ocean like it was absolving her of something she'd never spoken aloud. Sarah fell in love with Daniel too, which terrified her because Emma was supposed to be temporary. She'd planned to stay a few weeks, maybe a month, just long enough to remember who she was beneath the diagnosis and the betrayal and the fear. But Daniel made her want to be real again. He made her want to believe that Sarah Mitchell, cancer survivor, abandoned fiancé, former attorney drowning in medical debt, could be loved not despite her damage, but as a complete person who'd survived something terrible. The crisis came on a Tuesday morning when Daniel mentioned his sister was visiting next week, and desperately wanted to meet the woman who'd brought life back into his life. Sarah had spent the night before his house, something that had become more common, and the domestic simplicity of morning coffee and shared silence had felt like the life she'd lost and mourned. But his sister would ask questions. His sister would see through Emma immediately with the clarity of family members who know when something doesn't add up. Sarah could have disappeared. She'd planned for this possibility, keeping her packed bag in her car, maintaining her nomadic story and an exit strategy, but sitting across from Daniel with dawn light, making his tired eyes seem infinitely kind. She couldn't do it. She couldn't ghost this man who'd shown her that surviving meant more than just breathing. She couldn't prove her ex-fiancé right about her being too broken to love, so she told him everything. The cancer, and the chemotherapy, and the weight loss, and the hair that had slowly grown back, indifferent than before the betrayal and the loneliness, and the night she'd sat in her empty Boston apartment and realized she felt more dead than alive despite being in remission. The impulsive decision to run in the casual way she'd constructed Emma like a shield against being vulnerable ever again. The fear that had transformed into something beautiful over the past 3 months until she no longer recognized herself in the lie. Daniel listened without interrupting. His face was unreadable in that way people's faces become when they're processing information that requires them to reconstruct their understanding of reality. Sarah watched him catalog every moment they'd shared, seeing him evaluate which pieces were true and which were fabricated, watching him decide whether the woman before him was real enough to forgive. When she finished, silence stretched between them like the moment before a wave breaks. Sarah prepared herself for anger or betrayal or the particular kind of disappointment that cuts deeper than rage. Instead, Daniel reached across the table and took her shaking hands in his steady ones. He told her that he'd suspected something was different about her story, that the details never quite aligned, that she had the energy of someone fleeing rather than wandering. He told her he'd fallen in love with her anyway, with the woman who drew sunrises, because she was grateful to see them, who cried us stories of resilience, who touched her own skin, sometimes like she was surprised to still be inhabiting it. He told her that Emma had been a character, but Sarah sounded real, and real was what he wanted, even if real meant complicated and scared. Healing. Sarah cried then, the kind of crying that's been held back so long it emerges as something primal and cleansing. Daniel moved to her side of the table and held her in the coffee shop, while the owner tactfully busied himself in the back. He held her while she apologized for lying, and he held her while she explained that she didn't know if she'd stay in remission, that loving her meant accepting uncertainty and possible loss. He held her and told her that everyone was uncertain and possible, that his mother's Alzheimer's had taught him that loving people meant loving them in whatever time you were given, not just in the theoretical forever. If this story has touched your heart, if you've ever been afraid to show someone your true self, if you believe in love that's strong enough to survive truth, please hit that like button and leave a comment below telling us about a time someone saw the real you and loved you anyway. They didn't solve everything that morning. Sarah still had medical bills and trauma and the work of rebuilding a life that fit who she'd become. Daniel still had the fear that came with loving someone whose future included regular scans and the shadow of recurrence, but they made a choice that morning, in the coffee shop that smelled like cinnamon and new beginnings, to try being real together, to let go of Emma and Sarah's protective fictions, to build something true in this small coastal town where they'd both learned that starting over sometimes means finally being honest. 6 months later, Sarah would meet Daniel's sister and his students, and slowly the community that had accepted Emma without question. She'd start volunteering at a cancer support center, using her legal skills to help patients navigate insurance nightmares. She'd draw more and worry less about the next scan. Daniel would love her through the panic attacks before appointments and the survivor's guilt that sometimes woke her at 3 a.m. They'd have fights about real things instead of fictional adventures, and they'd learn that authentic love was harder and infinitely more valuable than the safe fantasy they'd begun with. But that morning, sitting in a coffee shop with the truth finally spoken, Sarah looked at Daniel and felt something shift inside her chest. She'd lied about who she was, but somehow he'd fallen for the person underneath anyway, and maybe that was the point, that we're all performing versions of ourselves, protecting our tender places, hoping someone will love us enough to look beneath the armor and find the beating, imperfect, gloriously alive heart underneath. If you believe in stories of redemption and real love, please comment "I believe in second chances" below. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more stories that celebrate the beautiful mess of Being human, the lie had been about safety. The truth was about courage, and love, it turned out, was about choosing honesty even when it hurt. Choosing each other even when uncertain. Choosing to build something real in a world that often felt too harsh for tender hearts. Sarah reached across the table one more time, and Daniel met her halfway. And in that small gesture was everything they'd need to begin again. This time as themselves.